Welcome, everybody. Those of you here in the room in person, those of you at home or wherever you may be on Zoom online. So welcome to the Chair in Transgender Studies Visiting Speakers Series. Really glad that you can all join us wherever you may be. I'm Aaron DeVore, and I'm the founder of the Chair in Transgender Studies, the Transgender Archives, and the Moving Trans History Forward conferences. So I'd like to start with the territorial acknowledgement. At UVic, we acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and the Saanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. We work to provide inspiration and hope to trans plus people and our allies everywhere. We contribute to the development and communication of accurate, research-based, real-world knowledge about trans plus people, and we want that knowledge to be used to build better policies, laws, and to drive social change. We also help to build strong and resilient trans plus social and cultural communities and individual well-being by facilitating arts, cultural, and social activities. You just saw some of that go by on video. And on all of it, we are committed to applying an intersectional lens in our work to advance reconciliation, racial justice, equity, and inclusion for all. So in addition to events like today's, we offer a lot of other services and activities. As I mentioned before, the Transgender Archives, which is the world's largest of its kind, the Interdisciplinary, International, and Intergenerational Biennial Moving Trans History Forward conferences, which I'll tell you a bit more about in a moment, scholarships for UVic students, and travel money for visiting fellows, and arts and cultural events. Coming up, very close in our minds because we're very busy in getting things ready, is the Moving Trans History Forward Conference, the 2023 edition. That runs from Thursday night, March 30th, to Sunday midday, April 2nd. And it will be, like this event, hybrid. So there'll be an in-person component and there will be online. And so you can join us here or wherever you may be. It includes over 100 speakers, an exciting opening night, 2 keynote events, an Indigenous, 2 spirit panel, an elders panel, a youth panel, meals, and coffee breaks. So there's a lot included. We are looking for volunteers to help with the conference. So anybody who might like to help, please email us at mthfcon, Moving Trans History Forward Conference, mthfcon@uvic.ca if you're interested. And so far, we've only announced one of our keynote speakers. That's Julia Serrano. Many of you will be familiar with her name and her works, and I think it's going to be a great talk. The name of the talk is Balancing Acts and Bottom-Up Approaches to Trans Activism. And I'm sure you can enjoy it, and we will be announcing other speakers and events in the coming weeks. So watch our website, watch our social media. We do have registration subsidies available, so we want everybody to be able to come to this. So go to our website and register, and if you would like to apply for a subsidy, there's a tick box and a way to do that. So watch for what's coming up in the future. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Jonah Garde is a PhD student at the Interdisciplinary Center for Gender Studies at the University of Bern, Switzerland. And they are currently a visiting research student at the Chair in Transgender Studies. For their PhD thesis, which looks at the modern colonial entanglements of early 20th century trans histories, Jonah has received a Rosa Luxemburg doctoral grant and a mobility scholarship from the University of Bern. Recent publications include Provincializing Trans Modernities, and together with Simon Noah Harder, Approaches to Transformative Pedagogies, a Conversation. And that transformative has an asterisk in the middle, but I don't know how to say that. I'll leave it to you to figure that one out. Okay, so the title of today's talk, Animal Connections, Sex Change, Racial Fantasies, and Trans Possibilities in the Early 20th Century. So in the spring of 1931, a strange story made headlines in the Austrian daily press. In order to change their sex, a well-known Viennese artist, had successfully persuaded the imperial zoo to sell them a black male goat as an organ donor. Transplanted into the person's abdomen, the goat's gonads were hoped to take root and transform the person's sex by secreting, quote, male hormones. Performed by a well-respected Viennese doctor, the sensational surgery quickly attracted several newspapers who sought interviews with the person in question and opened a debate about the possibility of so-called, quote-unquote, artificial sex changes. And so in this talk, Jonah talks about the fragmented stories like these and tells us about trans history, its colonial discontents, and how animals animated early ideas of, quote, sex change. So I'll turn it over. Please welcome Jonah Garde.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Aaron, for the lovely introduction, and also Michael and Jay, who are here to support and help setting up all the technical support that we are having right now. It's such a treat to be here and to be with you all in person, and with those of you who are online who I unfortunately cannot see. But I appreciate you all so much for taking the time in your days to be here. As Aaron said, this talk is part of my dissertation on trans histories of modernity in early 20th century Austria, which I'm going to defend in a couple of weeks at the University of Bern. And yeah, I had the great pleasure to finalize the dissertation at UVic here at the Chair in Transgender Studies over the past year. And it feels extra sweet to be here at the end of this journey and also be in the room with a lot of people that I shared some initial thoughts with already. Yeah, so that just fills my heart to have that as a ending and part of that journey. And it's in the spring of 1931, a strange story made headlines in the Austrian daily press. Several newspapers reported on a sensational surgery, subsequently named the most fascinating medical case of Vienna. The protagonists of which included not only the patient and a highly respected Viennese surgeon, but also a black ram. At the heart of the story was the desire of the patient, referred to by the newspapers as Hildegard R., a well-known Viennese painter, to receive a testicular transplant from an animal in order to masculinize his body and match his internal sense of self. In short, R wanted gender-affirming surgery, and the requested animal would provide the necessary raw material for such an undertaking. With this desire in mind, R had repeatedly contacted the former Imperial Zoo in Schönbrunn, requesting an animal as an organ donor, dreaming of a monkey, a lion, or even an eagle to become his organ donor. However, according to the newspapers, the management of the zoo had, again and again, rejected those requests, arguing that these animals were too high in value to be made into involuntary organ donors. Finally, however, the persistence paid off, and the zoo agreed to grant R a ram, a, quote, 3.5-year-old animal from the Schönbrunn sheep breeding, an ordinary breed with black fur whose male specimen are characterized by strongly backward bent horns. That R did not direct his desire for an animal donor towards a farm, a place of livestock breeding, or even a slaughterhouse, all of which might have been easily available, but that he instead had turned towards a zoo, which, in the words of Eva Hayward and Chigozet, is one of the primal scenes of conquest, nation building, and state power, already offers us a glimpse into the ways in which the desire for sex change, quote unquote sex change, in early 20th century Europe was animated by what Kaji Amin has aptly identified as a cannibalistic and erotic hunger for the glance of the other, and how this hunger was embedded in the complex registers of colonial fantasies and biopolitical power. The fact that the zoo had ascribed a lower value to the life of the ram compared to the initially requested monkey, lion, and eagle, which often serve as symbols of power, nation, and masculinity, is something I will return to. While this connection between quote-unquote sex change, animals, and dominant understandings of liveliness and beingness, as well as their colonial discontents, will become more clear throughout my paper, it is important to note that before R was able to make such a request to the zoo, he had to go through several medical and psychiatric evaluations in which he was examined, poked, and probed, had to perform his biographical narrative of, quote-unquote, always having felt like a man, until the doctors decided that he was indeed a suitable candidate for such an experimental surgery to relieve the ambiguity of his sexed and gendered appearance. Thus, it becomes apparent how the techniques of changing sex were deeply regulated and controlled in the early 20th century, maybe even contrary to contemporary beliefs about the 1920s as a queer and trans utopia. It is indeed this form of biopolitical regulation, the implementation of the medical authority, the immense costs associated with finding willing doctors and getting their approval, the medical violence, the politics of waiting that still haunt trans life and trans medical care until this day. Coming back to the story of R, the real sensation that animated the newspaper articles, however, was the surgery that followed the approval of the black ram as an organ donor by the Viennese Zoo. The fact that it was the surgery and not so much R's identity that was foregrounded by the sensationalist newspapers points to the ways in which the surgery did not only fascinate the reporters and readers alike, but was also celebrated as a victory of modern medicine. With great attention to detail, the newspapers described the course of the surgery. Being placed next to each other, the glands of the ram were transplanted into the abdomen of the human patient, thereby momentarily suspending the boundary between menagerie and operating room, male and female, nature and culture, animal and human. However, this transgression of the quote-unquote natural order was quickly restored post-operatively. While R was recovering, content in believing in the sex-changing abilities of the animal gonads that were taking root in his body, through the magic of the surgeon's knife, the goat was slaughtered the following day and fed to the other zoo animals. The ever so brief opening of the wound through which the categories of the human and the animal bled into each other was stitched back together by forcefully restoring the hierarchy of living beings and ultimately through the extinction of the animal's life. Like me, you might find this story wildly confusing, disturbing, entertaining in its sheer absurdity, or question its truth claims. Or maybe all of the above, really. After all, newspaper articles like these are not reliable historical resources, nor do they give us any access to the subjectivity of those described. In that sense, it's important to note that R does not so much emerge as a subject out of these articles, but rather as a story, a spectacle, and even a speculation. He's a phantasma of the press, and as such subject to its economic constraints and the sales-increasing logics of sensationalism, which is further highlighted by the fact that the stories about him were often printed on the front page of the newspapers. On the other hand, the fact that the zoo's archive has disposed of all correspondences pertaining to the years in which R would have likely made these requests and used those correspondences for heating, as the archivist had informed me, might make us pause and wonder whether the historical records did indeed contain anything that was subsequently classified as too controversial and therefore deliberately destroyed. These are questions that have to remain unanswered. But what seems like a hard-to-believe fictional story, transversal to our 21st century understandings of gender-affirming medical care, was actually not that unintelligible in early 20th century Europe. In that sense, it's irrelevant whether the stories about R and the Black Rum is true or not, because the knowledge that they constructed and called upon fed into the cultural imaginary of sex change in the early 20th century, in which animals and organ transplantation were front and center. In fact, media discourses such as these and the ways that they circulated influenced the readers' understandings of their own subjectivities, bodies, and medical possibilities. As John Meyerowitz, author of the influential book How Sex Changed, has argued, in the history of transsexuality, marginalized subjects used available cultural forms to construct and reconfigure their identities. Instead of turning to the clinic or the medical archive, I'm therefore interested in investigating the cultural archive, the stories and images that circulated in the public sphere and informed how people would make sense of themselves, their identities and their bodies, and how they would communicate their desires for gender-affirming medical care to others. What repertoire of images and discourses could they access to verbalize their desire for gender reassignment? What scripts about the other were embedded in these texts and images, and what proto-narratives for imagining possible and impossible futures could be derived from them? These are the questions that will guide what I share with you today. That being said, I hope that for the audience here today and online, it is redundant to state that trans life has existed and continues to exist before, outside of, and in opposition to the realm of medical interventions. And that just because folks have used this cultural archive to make themselves legible does not mean that they have wholeheartedly or even partially identified with the narratives provided within these texts and images. What I'm interested in is to understand how the cultural archive shaped the limits of what was intelligible at a time where the talk of quote-unquote sex change was pretty novel and the medical understandings of what would become known as transsexuality was just taking shape. In other words, how then did sex change as a concept enter into public discourse? Specifically, looking at the Austrian daily press, we can see that before 1910, there were only isolated reports about changes in sex, which were predominantly ascribed to sudden and unexpected transformations, such as in the case of Leopold Zahn, who at the age of 17, after having lived as a girl, suddenly grew a mustache and transformed into a young man. These sudden transformations of sex were usually attributed by the press to a mistake in the initial assignment of sex at birth, a human error, which only revealed itself in puberty. Speaking from today's perspective, the language of quote-unquote sex change before 1910 seems to have predominantly been used to refer to what we might now understand as intersex phenomena. While sex was represented as somewhat ambiguous in these reports, it was also being constructed as the truth of the body that might have been misinterpreted by the human eye, but was in and of itself understood as an unchanging and natural entity. While these reports about changes in sex were extremely sensationalist in their tone, they only appeared ever so often and did not seem to be of high interest to the newspapers or their readers, aside from the occasional tickle of voyeurism and wonder they inspired. However, this changed drastically after 1910. Suddenly, we can observe a significant increase in the ways in which the language of quote-unquote sex change appeared in public discourse. But instead of centering on human mistakes in assigning the right sex, those reports increasingly revolved around curious experiments and gland transplants performed by physicians and biologists in their laboratories. Nature, which was previously represented as something unruly and beyond human interpretation, was increasingly understood as controllable and modifiable. But not only that, also the term sex change itself became used in increasingly nuanced ways, and the newspapers started to differentiate between so-called natural sex changes and artificial or willful sex changes. Last but not least, the subject of these sex changes shifted. Suddenly, it was no longer humans who were at the center of the media frenzy over sex change, but rather it was chickens, frogs, guinea pigs, fish, insects, and rats who populated the cultural imagination about sex change. Which brings me to my next point. First popularized by Austrian biologist Eugen Steiner, animals and their glands were the raw materials for the newly established discipline of endocrinology and its knowledge production about sex, gender, and plasticity. It was especially Steiner's experiments with guinea pigs and rats, which he started publishing about in 1911, that established the idea of sex and gender as being mutable through organ transplants. His theories and experiments were built around an epistemic object, which he named the puberty gland. According to Steiner, this gland is part of the ovaries and testicles, but has no reproductive function. Instead, its purpose is to determine, develop, and stabilize sex, gender, and sexuality over time by secreting an invisible substance into the bloodstream, the so-called inner secretions, which later became termed sex hormones. Before those hormones were chemically isolated in the late 1920s and early 1930s, Steiner tried to prove their existence by transplanting the puberty gland of a female animal into the abdominal cavity of a castrated male animal. Excuse me. And for those of you wondering about the medical details of this procedure, it was truly as simple as it sounds. He would surgically remove the ovaries of one animal and place them into the abdominal opening of a male animal whose testicles had been removed. Because Steiner believed that the power of the puberty gland specifically lay in its ability to secrete invisible hormones into the bloodstream and thereby sex the otherwise unsexed castrated organism, he did not think it was necessary to transplant the ovaries at a specific place in the body or surgically attach them to any other organs. Rather, he thought that they would just take root anywhere in the body. So he would literally just drop them into the cavity. That's what happened. After the successful transplantation, for which Steiner had invented a whole set of surgical instruments befitting his animal patients, he claimed to witness a complete feminization of said animal, proven not only by the changes in its fur, size, and skeleton, but also by its sexual and gender behavior when compared to other members of the same family. In his argument, not only did the puberty gland invoke somatic changes in the bodies of the feminized animals, which resembled the characteristics of their female siblings, but they were indeed transformed into individuals with a quote-unquote complete female character and female psyche. How cultural understandings of sex and gender informed Steiner's views becomes apparent when we read the following description of a feminized guinea pig. So the quote goes as follows. The overall appearance of the feminized males is completely that of natural females. But not only the physical, also the psychosexual characteristics have become female. The feminized animals show no masculine drive, no masculine courage or aggression. Rather, they appear cowardly and fearful, displaying all the typical feminine reactions and movements. Evidence of the successful feminization, they are immediately recognized by the normal male as animals with feminine appeal, are passionately pursued and mounted, in short, treated as females. The highest proof of the successful sex change, according to Steiner, however, was the fact that the feminized animals started taking care of the species' offspring, nursing them, quote unquote, like a loving and caring mother. Similarly, in another set of experiments, the then masculized animals did not only exhibit typical masculine physical features, but also engaged in masculine mating habits and aggression towards other male members of the species. In short, what Steiner developed was at once a theory of the puberty gland as the essence of sex, and simultaneously a theory, and more importantly, also a surgical practice to transform and change that essence within one organism. His theories of the puberty gland, hormones, and what he had termed artificial sex change became a central point of reference for the medical discourse on transsexuality, which fully emerged approximately 30 years later in the 1950s. And while a lot can be said about how Steiner's theories themselves were informed by colonial fantasies about race, plasticity, and the tropics in ideological but also very material ways, I want to return to the cultural archive and how Steiner's research circulated and informed public understandings of sex change. Because even before his work was taken up by medical doctors such as Walter Benjamin to describe and define the phenomenon that would become known as transsexuality in the 1950s, Steiner's research and the animals on which he and others performed those experimental sex change surgeries were popularized in European and US American media press. As Meyerowitz has argued, especially print media, where the quote, cultural location where sex change had made its public debut. Mass media, and especially print, were the cultural site through which sex change left the laboratory and entered the minds of the public. The media's coverage of Steiner's research did not only encourage individuals to understand their bodies as controlled by all kinds of invisible glands and inner secretions, thus producing specific self-understandings and new forms of subjectivity, but the reports on the artificial sex changes performed on lab animals of all kinds led people to turn to physicians requesting similar procedures. The earliest known example of how the mass media coverage of Steiner's experiments influenced understandings of sex and gender as malleable can be found in a case study published in 1916 by German sexologist Max Marcuse. In his text, Geschlechtsumwandlungstrieb, which can be translated into the drive for sex change, Marcuse recounts the case of his patient A, who had contacted him after she had learned about the experiments of the director of the zoological garden in Dresden, Gustav Brandes, through a daily newspaper. And you can see the newspaper article on the side of the screen right now. The newspaper article, published in 1914, titled Artificial Sex Change, had reported that Brandes, inspired by Steiner's experiments with rats and guinea pigs, had performed a gonad transplantation on deer, which resulted in the masculinization of a doe and the feminization of a deer. This report prompted A to contact Marcuse, asking whether such an operation could also be performed on humans, and whether A could be, quote-unquote, made into a woman. A few years later, a similar story pointing to the significance of media representations of Steiner's research can be found in a case study by Swiss psychiatrist Hans Binder, who shared the story of one of his patients who, after learning about Steiner's experiments through the newspapers, in the pathologizing view of Binder, became, quote-unquote, obsessed with the idea to become a woman through an ovary transplantation. Both of these patients, unlike R, did not explicitly ask for animal donors, but nevertheless, it was the media's representation of animals in their bodies that animated their desire for sex change, despite the fact that the newspaper articles had clearly stated that the application of this procedure in humans was limited and could only ever be used to, quote-unquote, heal ambiguities by transplanting a healthy puberty gland, but never to change a person's sex. However, taking a closer look at the ways the newspapers reported on sex change reveals that some bodies have always been positioned as more animalistic than human, and those prone to the malleability of sex. According to the newspaper reports, it was especially so-called lower animals whose sex proved to be particularly changeable and malleable both through surgical interventions, but also in the course of quote-unquote naturally occurring phenomena. As one newspaper proclaimed, quote, "The science of life teaches that sex changes in low-developed animals are by no means rare and become more frequent the lower we descend on the ladder of the animal kingdom." While quote-unquote complete sex changes in humans were represented as either unheard of or only successful in cases of quote-unquote high-degree hermaphroditism, or disregarded as completely impossible altogether, animals, especially those considered as quote-unquote lower animals, seem to have been the prime subjects of sex change. The repeated allusion to the lower status of these animals makes clear that sex change in the cultural imaginary of the 1920s and 1930s was inseparably intertwined not only with animality, but also with the specific primitiveness of those animals. The fact that the newspapers summed up species as diverse as oysters, crabs, worms, swordfish, chickens, and smaller rodents under the term lower animals is due to the term itself not indicating a stable taxonomic category. The distinction between higher and lower forms of life and beingness has a long tradition within European philosophy and nature, going back to Aristotle's great chain of being, which arranged all matter and life in a hierarchical order, from the stones and plants imagined as inanimate, via the animals to the human, and above whom medieval Christianity placed the angels and God. Sorry. The distinction between higher and lower animals became especially popular following Charles Darwin's publication on the origin of species in 1859. In it, Darwin used the term lower animals to describe a certain developmental stage in his theory of evolution as progress. In contrast to the great chain of being, in which the lower ordered life forms occupied a relatively static place, Darwin's lower animals were characterized not only by a presumably less complex and less differentiated organism, but they were also inscribed in a hierarchy of development. Within the narrative of evolution as progress, they represented the primitive past of all higher developed forms of life. While in Darwin's theory of evolution, very different species populated the place of the lower, they shared a common developmental distance from the highest form of being, the human. This idea still haunts the Western concept of the human and its relationships to animals today. While quote-unquote higher animals are imagined to be closer to humans, perhaps even similar in behavior and physique, and often live as domestic or farm animals in their immediate proximity, quote-unquote lower animals, are considered to be fundamentally different and incompatible with human forms of being. The category of lower animals is thus an inherently anthropocentric one, meaning it's centered on the belief that the human is a distinct and superior form of being. And while some non-human animals are described human behavior and emotions and are allowed to linger in the threshold between nature and culture, so-called lower animals are considered as less sentient within Western thought. Without consciousness and morality, their behavior is thought to be determined exclusively by their instincts, and they are imagined as an inherent part of nature. In contrast, the human is considered to belong to the sphere of culture, dominating and controlling nature. Simultaneously, lower animals and humans are bound to each other in what Malchen has termed an animacy hierarchy, assigning them different levels of liveliness and beingness. This animacy hierarchy frames certain bodies as active, valuable, possessing agency, and worthy of protection, whereas other bodies are framed as inanimate, passive, and as a resource to be used. This hierarchy deeply influenced the cultural imaginary of sex change, brought forward by the German-speaking print media of the early 20th century. For it was the bodies of the so-called lower animals that were imagined to be both infinitively malleable through science and technology, but also inherently plastic and unstable, given their quote-unquote primitive status, which distinguishes them from higher animals and humans, whose sex is imagined as relatively stable and unchanging. To some extent, this also reveals a discrepancy between Steiner's theories of sex change and the way that they were negotiated in public discourse. While Steiner himself was convinced that the plasticity of sex characterizes all species, it seems that in the popular discourse of the daily newspapers, this phenomenon was narrowly applied to non-human animals. Walter Finkler, a popular science journalist at the time with a background in biology, who penned dozens of articles for the Austrian daily press on the phenomenon of successful sex changes in animals, despite being intimately aware of Steiner's research, wrote in 1923 that, quote, the means to produce desired sex changes in a man will certainly not be available for decades to come. Given the frequency of press reports about successful sex changes, many of them penned by himself, Finkler's somewhat pessimistic note regarding the impossibility of sex change in humans can be read as a reassurance to a society marked by cultural anxieties around shifts in sex, gender, and sexuality. He tries to convey that the possibility of quote-unquote artificial sex changes only exists on the non-human side of the human-animal binary, and that society's order of sex was still in place. According to him, quote, the possibility of a real sex change does not exist for humans. The instability of sex and its malleability was thus established as the demarcation line between what was considered human and non-human, as the hierarchy of beingness merged with a hierarchy of sex stability in what could be called, to riff off Nelchen, an animacy plasticity hierarchy. This hierarchy was deeply political and shaped by who counts as human and who does not. Thus, it was also underpinned by racialized and colonial fantasies, which leads me to my last section. Sex change was not only constructed as an animalistic trait in the media discourse of early 20th century, but animated by the ghosts of the colonial archive, it was also presented as a feature of a quote-unquote primitivity of sex of racialized others, showing that racialization and animalization went hand in hand, and that the animalization of sex change was always already encompassed its racialization. To illustrate this, I want to draw your attention to another set of articles published by science journalist Walter Finkler in 1922 and in 1928, in which he linked sex change in animals, in this particular case, swordfish, bees, and rats, to colonial accounts of indigenous gender transgressions. For while, according to Finkler, a real sex change in humans was impossible, the mujerados do come pretty close. This seemingly anachronistic reference is based on a long tradition of colonial anthropological knowledge production, as well as the popular circulation of colonial fantasies about the pueblos and their sex gender systems within the European imaginary. The term mujerado first entered the colonial archives in June 1882, 40 years before Finkler's article was published, when US military physician and neurologist William Hammond gave a lecture to the American Neurological Society about his research in New Mexico 30 years earlier. The report, which later became known as the Hammond Report, and which is reproduced almost word by word in Finkler's article, extensively dealt with indigenous gender configurations, or rather, Eurocentric interpretations of them. The central figure of Hammond's report is a woman about who Hammond was told that she had, by some means, changed her sex from male to female, and that she had been accepted as such by her community, dressing, living, and working as the other women did. She was called the mujerado, which Hammond translates as effeminate man, although the literal translation, woman, mentioned by Hammond, points to a fundamental ontological shift in sex and gender that goes beyond the idea of feminine behavior and instead seems to describe a process which, in my view, is better translated as becoming a woman. In this brief moment of mistranslation, however, the divergence between Hammond's interpretation and indigenous epistemologies that become buried by Hammond's authority and that would characterize Hammond's encounter with the mujerado already can be felt. For Hammond, mujerados were an equally fascinating as well as archaic phenomenon, which in his mind would, quote unquote, doubtlessly disappear long before advancing civilization, a settler colonial desire that never became reality. Obviously fascinated by the stories he had heard, which were accompanied by, quote unquote, numerous injunctions of caution and secrecy, Hammond had asked the chief of the pueblo, whose personal physician he was, to arrange a personal meeting between him and the unnamed woman. Although Hammond's request was initially met with skepticism, Hammond prevailed, and after a little hesitation, the meeting took place. After being led to a group of women kneeling on the ground, grinding grain, which Hammond swiftly interprets as another sign of the pueblo's lack of technology and therefore, quote unquote, backwardness, one of the women Hammond was introduced to as the mujerado, and they were led into a separate room where he subjected her to an invasive and voyeuristic examination, which I will not go into detail about. While Hammond's report constructs her as a medical object and not as a human being, thus pointing to the myriad ways that what Jamie Jesperson, who is in the room here, has aptly termed a distinct colonial structure of transmisogyny, works not only through literal death, but also through the dehumanization and objectification of trans femininity. Her ghosts, nevertheless, haunted the cultural imagination about sex change in the 1920s, when Finkel picked up her story. To understand the reappearance of this account and the specter of the Mujerado in the context of popular newspaper reports on sex change in the 1920s, it's helpful to note that animals also played a central role in Hammond's description, as, according to Hammond, excessive horse riding was used to willfully atrophy the genitals, a practice that did not go unmentioned in the newspaper articles of the 1920s. Animals here were not so much the vehicle to imagine the transgression of sex binaries or the medical raw material by which to achieve such an undertaking, but they are presented as an integral part of transition itself. Unlike phenomena of gender transgression in late 19th century Europe, where, according to Hammond, the individuals in question were merely under the illusion of the transformation of sex, quote unquote, they were as much man or as much women as they ever were. The Mujerado, by virtue of their presumed, quote unquote, primitive sex, were actually capable of changing their sex through various cultural techniques, Hammond thought. Although Hammond made this observation several decades before the popular discourses on artificial sex change took root, it is this argument that made his report compatible, as it allowed cultural anxieties around sex and the crumbling certainties about the gender binary to be contained in the figure of the Mujerado. As Susan Stryker has pointed out regarding anthropological engagements with non-European configurations of bodies, identities, sex, and gender, these categories were not only sources of Eurocentric fascination and targets of colonial violence, but, to quote, just as importantly, categories of divine personhood constructed by European imaginary and invested with the magical power to condense and contain, and thereby delimit a more systemic European failure to grasp a radical cultural otherness in its totality. The colonial imagination about the sex of the Mujerados thus not only animated popular discourses on artificial sex change in the 1920s, but it proves to be an effective colonial fantasy that haunts the archives of modern sexology. It's in Krafft Ebing's Psychopathia Sexualis from 1894, Hirschfeld's Die Transvestiten 1910, but also in Harry Benjamin's The Transsexual Phenomenon in 1966, that we can find some of the traces of the Hammond's report, thus illustrating how the archives of sexology and transsexuality are not only littered with the corpses of animals, but also deeply entangled with the project of European colonialism, its fantasies, and its inscriptions of what it meant to be human. The significance of the ghostly hauntings of the Mujerado lies, in my view, in the multiple uses to which the figure is being put. For Hammond, they were a symbol of indigenous backwardness. For Krafft Ebing, an ethnological proof of his taxonomy of acquired homosexuality. For Hirschfeld, they were indicative of his theory of sexual intermediacy, as well as proof of his thesis of the historical as well as cultural universality of sex-gender transgressions. Finally, in the Austrian popular media in the 1920s, the Mujerados functioned as a welcome container for social anxieties about the mutability and malleability of sex on the one hand, as well as a useful vehicle for critiquing modernity, its emancipation movements, and the crisis of the modern sex-gender system in Europe, as Finkler's concluding remark makes clear, where he writes that, quote, "We do not need to marvel at the indigenous Mujerados, since modernity has provided us with a counterpart, the masculinization of women. Only there the fuss at least has meaning and remains limited to isolated individuals. But here, while the Mujerados served as a sign of racialized backwardness in the Eurocentric imagination, the masculine woman symbolizes the modern gender system getting out of joint. However, for a person like R, who desired to change his sex through surgical intervention, the colonial specter of the Mujerados might have reinforced the belief that sex change indeed was a transpossibility in the early 20th century, thus also foreshadowing contemporary romantic appropriations of trans indigeneity within Western trans cultures." Thank you.
I want to remind you that we do all kinds of programming throughout the year in support of trans+ people and our allies, people who are looking for information about the community now and looking to join community right now, and also to understand the past. as part of what we heard about today. So if you like what we do, please help us to continue doing this important work. So contrary to what many people think, the chair in Transgender Studies is not an endowed chair. Our survival depends on the goodwill from UVic and on donations from people like you. So please donate if you can, and if you can't, please encourage your wealthy friends to donate to the chair in Transgender Studies. So you can use your phone to scan this QR code, and that will take you to a link, and you can donate online. And of course, we also accept cash. So thank you to those of you who can make financial contributions, and for those of you who can twist somebody else's arm to make financial contributions. And thank all of you for being part of our community. So thank you again to Jonah, and we'll see you at future events.